From the death of Martin Luther in 1546, the Protestants, the confessional Protestants, that is the Lutherans and the Reformed, entered into a struggle over the question of who were Luther's heirs. Who were the heirs to Luther's theological legacy? And of course, if you ask the confessional Lutherans in the 16th century and even today, they will tell you, well, of course, we are. And that's true to a large degree. But there are some discontinuities between what one finds, for example, in Orthodox Lutheranism in the Book of Concord and what one finds in Luther himself. And, of course, in that case, I'm arguing for a kind of Luther versus the Lutherans in certain ways, not in every way, I don't think in fundamental ways, but in ways where I think the Reformed were actually more faithful to Luther. For example, on predestination, election, and perseverance of the saints. And those would be some ways in which I think perhaps the Reformed got Luther, and the Reformed thought that they got Luther better than the Orthodox Lutherans did. And that was a matter of contention, well into the late 16th century. At a colloquy in France in 1580, Theodore Beza, who had yet to, who was like Calvin's colleague and would yet live till 1605. So in 1580, when he was still a relatively young man, he stood up at the colloquy when they got to the topic of election and predestination, and he held up his copy of Luther's On the Bondage of the Will and said, "We stand with Luther." And at least according to Jill Rayett, the Lutherans said, "Next topic."
Truth is stranger than fiction.
I think that's amusing because if you read the transcript, at least the English language translation of the Lutheran account of the colloquy, then it's not hard to imagine people doing stooge-like eye pokes and bonking each other over the head. It's a debate between cousins. And anyway, so our boy Casper thought of himself very much as Luther's heir. For example, late in his career, he wrote a little popular German language explanation of the Calvinist understanding of the Lord's Supper, and in it he wrote that he thought that had Luther opportunity, of course, Luther was long gone by then, but Luther had the opportunity to read this, would probably approve. Now, whether that's true is another matter, but I'm just saying that's what he thought. That's how he understood himself, and he wasn't alone. That's the way a lot of the Reformed thought of themselves relative to Luther. They didn't feel hostile to him. They thought of him very warmly. And for a good example of that, take a look at the essay I wrote for the Southern Baptist Journal. It's online. You can go to heidelblog.net/publications, and you'll see the essay there on Calvin as Luther's son, which is how he described himself. And I tried to document the way that Calvin thought of himself relative to Luther. Now, I'm not saying that defines objective reality, that just because Calvin thought something, that necessarily made it true, but it is interesting to see how he thought of himself relative to Luther. And I think it's interesting, too, for us as contemporary 21st century Reformed people, assuming that you're listening to this in the 21st century and that somehow this recording hasn't persisted into the 22nd century. Well, that's a kind of a weird thought. Anyway, it's interesting for us to realize or remember or learn how closely connected the early Reformed felt and thought themselves to be to Martin Luther. And that's important, I think, particularly for American Reformed people, and I'm going to pick on my Presbyterian friends, particularly American Presbyterians, who, it seems to me, don't feel very connected to Luther. One of the reasons that we run so many quotations from Luther on the Heidelblog is to help people see how much we have in common with Luther and how much we learned from Luther, how indebted we are to Luther. And if you know Luther and then you read Olivianus, you will see lots and lots of connections. And that's because he was, obviously, it seems to me as I read him, very well read in Luther. Not that he agreed with Luther on everything. He didn't. But Luther was a big influence on him, as was Calvin and as were lots of other sources. But no source was more influential on Casper than Calvin, and I think right after that would be Luther among his major influences.